business leaders face uncertainty and volatility. Non-humans are entering the workplace. Memes control the stock market. And geopolitics is a business concern. Disruption isn't a future concept. It's here. I am Justin Brady, and using 7,000 predictions and 12 major workplace trends from SHRM, you and I will sit down with psychologists, CEOs, scientists, entrepreneurs, and analysts to make sense of it all. This show isn't about the future. It's about actions to take tomorrow. This is Tomorrowist. I'm Justin Brady, and on top of all the leadership challenges that are here, technology, crazy technology, the global distributed workforce. What else is there? There's workplace change, work from home, work from office. That debate still rages on. On top of all of that, now, as if that's not enough, more generations than ever are going to be working together at the same time. So, leaders, good luck, because the data shows that many of you aren't even prepared for any of this at all. So I don't know what we're going to do other than have Lindsey Pollak on the show, New York Times bestselling author of The Remix, which is exactly what you talk about. You're a multi-generational workplace expert, so I'm glad you're here, Lindsey. Thank you so much for coming on Tomorrowist.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's going to be fun. What I love about the book is I know a lot of leaders have a little bit of panic about this, but the core fundamentals of every generation that as you write are very much the same. Most generations really at their core want the same thing, but there are some differences. Can you unpack that a little bit? I think that's a good setup for this show.
Yeah, absolutely. So the headline, as you mentioned, is that for the first time ever, we have 5 distinct generations in the workplace all around the world. And the reason is not because young people keep coming in. That's always happened. The reason is people are working a lot longer into their lives. So you might be managing someone or being managed by someone 20, 30, 40, 50 years different from you in age. And I started 20 years ago by teaching people how to manage millennials because everyone was panicked about how we would manage this new generation of millennials. And I always felt a little uncomfortable with that because we were just appealing to this one cohort. And then Gen Z came in, and I'm a Gen Xer, and everyone else is here. And what I realized over the years that culminated in my book, The Remix, which came out in 2019, is you can't just become a manager or a colleague to one generation. You have to have this quality of being able to work with people of all different ages. And I think that's the strategy for the future.
Right. And now, so there are some differences because your research, your book aligns with other people that are other experts in this space. A couple names come to mind: Jessica Kriegel and David Allison. So your research aligns with that. But you do point out the fundamentals are the same. But yes, there are a few differences, and those differences are worth paying attention to. Just some of the ones that you write down. The younger generations now, Z, millennials, future generations, there's less marriage, there's more divorce now. The workplace now, many men haven't even experienced a draft before, which wasn't the case with older generations. Women have more education than they used to. There are kid issues, there are marriage issues. What are the core differences leaders need to be aware of?
So I think the core comes down to expectations. So your expectations are really developed by what you see all around you and expect the workplace to reflect. So if you're entering the workplace in 1950, you expect most of your leaders to be men. If you're entering the workplace today, you don't have that expectation. What technology do you think will be on your desk? How diverse will your colleagues be? How global will your job be? Will AI be part of your job? All of this changes over time. So I don't think that we're fundamentally different human beings. I think it's somewhat similar to country of origin. If you're born into France, you probably grow up speaking French and you expect that. And other countries, it's very different. So I think it's really important to come back to that core that we're all human beings, but our expectations change based on what we see all around us. So the question I ask people is not, how old are you? The question I ask is, when you first started work, what did the environment look like? What was that experience like to you? And that kind of takes the age issue out of the conversation.
Yeah, because you have some neural pathways that are set. It's not a matter of the person being fundamentally different. We all want love, we all want respect, we all want flexibility to a degree, but there are some neural pathways that do get set when you're younger, so that makes a lot of sense. One of the things I got to ask. I'm reading this book and you have this incredible point where you basically say if a leader says they struggle with managing Gen Z, or if a leader says they really struggle with managing Gen Y, that's actually a symptom of a bigger problem.
Well, I think that a good manager is good at managing lots of different kinds of people.
Hmm.
And a bad manager can be bad at managing anybody. So I think what you're saying, if you say, I just don't like managing those Gen Zs or I just don't like managing those Gen Alphas, is there's something about them that I kind of can't handle. And to me, really good managers say, I can manage anybody. I'm just going to have to adapt my style to understand them. And so the biggest tip that I ever give when people say if there's one thing you could change, just spend time with people of the generation you find most challenging. You'll see that they're human beings. And I think the analogy here is family, right? We all have family members of all different ages, and we have something in common that connects us. And when we spend time with people, whether they're 5 years old or 100 years old, you find commonalities. So to me, saying that you just don't like one generation is sort of a symptom of your own block, not something about that generation.
Yeah, it's a great point. And as I'm reading this, I have this big question in my head, which is it the generations entering the workforce? And I know you have like total, you almost have in the book. I don't know if we have time to get into this today. You have like 7 different like micro generations you actually break down, which I'd heard of the Oregon Trail generation because I fit in that box. But that was a little mind blowing as well, which you're like, yeah, okay, so every millennial might not actually fit the same generational category. So 5, maybe 7, actually, which makes things more complicated. But is that actually the complicated thing, or do we have is it the fact that all this is happening at the same time we kinda have a leadership crisis? Because you mentioned Peter Drucker in your book, and he kinda I feel like in the '50s, he was addressing some of this stuff, so some of this stuff shouldn't be new. Is it just the fact that it's coming at the same time we have a leadership crisis?
None of this should be new because we've had young people enter the workplace every year forever. And I love that you're bringing those two pieces together kind of leadership crisis, what changes, what doesn't, and this micro generation concept, which basically is that we have these huge categories of 15 to 20 years, like baby boomer, right? If you're born between 1946 and 1964, you're officially baby boomer. But there are a lot of people who said, I'm born in that cohort, but I don't feel the same as somebody born 15 years older than I am. So we had this group kind of self form who called themselves Generation Jones, as in keeping up with the Joneses. They didn't feel like they were boomers. I'm starting to see more and more and more groups like that come out. In fact, I've had people in my workshops who are from the college class of 2020 say, I think we're our own generation because of the uniqueness of graduating during COVID, the class of 2008,
Oh.
and oh, the financial crisis. That was such a unique moment in time. So that says to me two things. We have this human desire to find other people who had the exact same experience that we did. And we also have this common need to do that. So we all sort of understand it while we identify differently. And so, what I think is true forever is we used to be much more rigid in what we thought work should be like 9 to 5, straight up the career ladder, up or out, my way or the highway. I think humans haven't changed. I think our willingness to adapt to lots of different ways of working has changed. And so it's kind of easy to manage in the command and control style. I tell you what to do, you do it. I don't really care what you think. What I think has changed is we are much more open to all these different ways of being. And when people see that, they say, oh, cool, I want to be this way and I want to be this way. And so they've spoken up more and left organizations that aren't adapting to that. So I totally agree that those two concepts are really related.
Yeah, and that goes back to what you say is the fundamentals are the same, usually, always.
Yeah.
But Gen Z and millennials will actually voice things that baby boomers and Gen X are thinking, but maybe don't say. This is interesting. Like all these generations, I want to go back to the leadership crisis because you point out a few things indicative of the leadership crisis. Like bad measurement. Like leaders just aren't measuring anything, bad communications, and then conflict avoidance. There are others you point out. These are just three that stuck out to me. Are these three one? And maybe there's a better one, out of measurement, bad comms, and conflict avoidance. Those were just the ones I wrote down that I thought were particularly important. But if if leaders resolve those three things, does some of the generational differences kind of iron themselves out, or is it a little bit more complicated?
Yes, I want to share with the audience some tips, and they're so simple. I almost feel sometimes embarrassed to say, people, come to me and they say, Lindsay, what do my Gen Zs want?
Yeah.
And I always say, have you asked them?
Ooh.
Some of this is really pretty basic, but we just don't have that tool in our toolkit. So if you don't know how somebody else wants to communicate, ask them how they communicate best and tell them how you expect to communicate best. If somebody wants flexibility, we sort of make this assumption that they want wild amounts of flexibility instead of saying, Justin, what flexibility is meaningful to you? And it might be a lot smaller than I anticipate. So much of this comes down to communication, listening, and being a little bit flexible and open. I say it's about curiosity, clarity, and connection. And if you can get those three things right, you can probably work with people of any generation.
Listening is the dangerous one, I think, because it seems like when you present this to an executive leader and you say, y'all need to listen better, it's so simple, and it's so simple. It's very effective. You're 100% right, by the way. You're 100% right. But it's so simple that I feel like leaders just gloss right over it. And so in the book, you give this really good example of you will go into a new work culture, you'll be working with them, and then the employees will just open up to you and tell you how to fix all the problems in the organization almost without prompting. And they're just like, oh my gosh, thank you for listening to us. And you're sitting here scratching your head thinking, why wasn't this happening earlier? Is one of the core problems in all our organizational cultures that leaders just flat out don't listen?
I think there's a humility piece that I think sometimes leaders feel like it's their job to solve all the problems. And so when the employees come up with
Ooh.
ideas, it's almost usurping their position as the problem solvers rather than saying, what a fantastic idea. I think there's also the fear that, so number one is, I thought I was supposed to be smart enough to come up with the answers. And the second is, the idea that if you ask employees to come up with ideas, they're going to expect that you do all of them. And I don't think either of them, is necessarily true. If you have people who give ideas like the good old suggestion box, you can say, we got all of your ideas. We certainly can't implement all of them. We've chosen three that had a lot of traction that we think will work, and we're delighted to implement them. I think that this idea that good ideas can come from anywhere is really powerful. And something I'm really paying attention to is there's this bubbling movement, something I've been saying for years, and people thought I was crazy, this bubbling movement that maybe every corporate board in America should have a member of every generation. That's a little threatening to people who've been working for 30, 40, 50 years. But if you want to serve all generations of employees and customers, shouldn't we have all voices present? And I'm just starting to hear that for the first time. And I think it's really interesting.
Yeah, so you're saying it's not necessarily always a beating my chest ego kind of thing. Sometimes it does come from care, like I'm supposed to be the shepherd of this flock, and so that's my job. But people aren't sheep, and part of being a great leader is listening to the people. I think there's a quote in here you mentioned from a Google executive about pick an area people are frustrated by and let them fix it, which is so, again, dangerously simple, right?
Laszlo Bock at Google, former head of people at Google, if there's something going wrong, let the people who are experiencing it fix it. And there's often a generational component. If I can share, I was working with a summer camp, a sleepaway camp. And of course, the teenage counselors wanted to use their phones. And the head of the camp said, but you're with the children. No. And what they said was, look, we understand that we can't use our phones when we're with the children, but you've put the lockers where we can lock up our phones so far away that when we have a break, it takes so long to get there, we don't have time. Could we just move the lockers closer? And so the leader, the boss, was thinking, oh, they're terrible employees. These Gen Zs, they just want to be on their phones. And they said, yeah, but we just want to have closer access to them. We don't want to break any rules. So I think another piece of this is assume the best intentions of your employees of all generations, that they really do want to do a good job, and that sometimes the solutions are coming from ideas that the leader never would have thought of because they don't have that mindset of the same expectations of the generation who is experiencing the problem. And I thought that was a great example of wanting to do good, but wanting to be able to use your phone during a break, which seems totally logical, and they solve the problem.
Yeah, and the more you read about this, you read about lockers close to phones, or sometimes open workspaces, sometimes private spaces, sometimes a cafe space. I think you yourself talk about in the book how you like to mix that up a little bit. I think it can be overwhelming for leaders a little bit, but under all that, are workplaces really tapping into like the hyper focused customization culture? Like, are benefits and workplace design very much just customizable to make employees happy? Like, is this what we should be doing?
So I think there's a really important distinction between unlimited customization and flexibility and more than we have now. Right. So, for example, no, you cannot work from home one day and from a desk next. You can't have 37 options. But if you only have in the office, you could maybe have three options. We also, on the benefits question, really have to get rid of the judgment. So I've had people say somebody called in, didn't come into work because their pet was sick. And I always say, but if their child was sick, you would think that was okay. So can you take away your own judgment that some choices are right or wrong, but taking time off for a reason that you yourself might not take time off still has to be acceptable. So if you have, paid leave for a loved one, that could be a child, that could be an elder, that could
Right.
be a partner, that could be a pet. And so I'm starting to see people say, "Oh, I get it now. It's the choice, it's the flexibility, but I can't judge how people use that." And again, not unlimited. I'm not a fan of unlimited vacation, unlimited PTO, unlimited work flexibility. But how do you offer one more choice or two more choices?
Clarity is important because
Mhm.
sometimes people take so much broad, overarching policies and they have no idea what to do with it.
Right.
But so it sounds like, and I don't know the mechanics, how this breaks down mechanically for leaders, but it sounds almost like an onboarding or quarterly or yearly. They're like check boxes. Do you want, because student debt is a thing now. It wasn't a thing. I mean, it was always a thing, but it wasn't a big thing when the boomers were in the workplace. So retirement contributions were kind of a benefit package. But maybe for the workplace now, it's not about fighting over who has the loudest voice. Like, well, we're moms. We think maternity leave should be good. And we think paternity leave should be the most important thing. And someone else is like, well, I have a sick parent. I think that should be the most important thing. Someone else is like, I can't plan for retirement right now. I got to get the loans paid off. Maybe it's as simple as offering benefits packages that are customizable. So when you're onboarding, you check boxes like, I want the company to contribute to my student loan thing, or I want them to contribute to my Roth IRA. Is that kind of where the workplace goes?
Yeah, PwC was one of the first companies that did that. They found out that their millennials were not taking their 401k match. And they said, why? They asked their employees why. And they said, well, because we have student loans. And it was an aha. But here's what I find so interesting generationally. Now, PwC and about 30% of US companies say we'll either match your 401k contribution for retirement or your student loan repayment or a combination of both. But here's the thing, there are plenty of people in their 30s and 40s and 50s who want to go back to school for a career change. They use the student loan. There are plenty of grandparents who help their grandchildren pay. They have access. So we also can't say, here's our Gen Z benefit and here's our baby boomer benefit. We simply open up to more choices and you end up serving people you didn't even expect that you were going to serve.
Yeah, it's really a fascinating approach because leaders are overwhelmed by like, who do we serve? Because someone's going to be mad. Well, if you listen to people, maybe you can actually serve pretty much everybody and everyone's happy. Last topic before I let you go, there's this really fascinating topic you talk about in the book, which is what I call this very difficult decision between training and common sense. You mentioned that like you may think something's common sense and some things like how to politely respond on email or like how to answer the phone, but it's not so common. So how do we know what we should expect out of a new employee, common sense, and what we should train? Is there some type of test or how do we figure that out?
So, this is a generational topic because most people in previous times learn how to type a business letter, how to answer a
Ugh.
telephone. These were things that were taught. They're no longer taught. And frankly, I don't know how to teach someone to respond on Slack in a, friendly channel with GIFs. There are no rules anymore. And so my rule of thumb is a quote that I love from Brene Brown: clear is kind. We start being nice by saying, do it however you want or figure it out. There are no rules here. That's actually unkind. And what's kind is to say, here are the tasks that we do all the time. And here are some guidelines. They're not hard and fast rules that say you have to write these exact words, but here are some examples. Here are some templates. Here are some best practices that you can use as a guideline. So showing people examples. Also, whenever somebody does make a mistake, say, oh, I bet other people are going to make that mistake too. Let's write down what that is. So to me, whenever you hear anyone call anything an unwritten rule, I want a big red flashing light to go off that says, write down that unwritten rule, because somebody isn't going to know that. So anything you think is obvious, just write it down, not word for word, but guidelines.
And find ways to ask. If you notice someone struggling, just don't say, "Hey, knock it off." Instead, go up to them and say, "Hey, can I help you with that?" And I'm sure there's a better way to broach that topic. Really, maybe we can squeeze this in really quickly, but the 50%, you mentioned this in the book, 50% or get zero onboarding training. These are employees. 58% of managers are getting zero leadership training. 64% of millennials don't feel prepared to lead. 3% of companies are investing in upskilling. And in academia, 96% of academia says they're preparing students. And 11% of business leaders say, they're not preparing anybody. So why do we have, and again, probably just 30 seconds on this, why do we have such a major leadership and training gap, and what can be done about that?
I think that higher education is teaching young people to be thinkers and to have the capability to learn how to thrive in the workplace. Frankly, I think every employer needs to train anyone who walks into their door in what their expectations are. We've left it up to each individual manager, and a lot of them don't do it. So onboarding, training, guidelines, absolutely critical. We used to do this in the past, and I think we need to do it again.
And if you were leaving it to every manager and you were training them well, maybe it would go well for you. But because no one's being trained and you're leaving it to every manager, it's making things that much worse. Lindsey Pollak, New York Times bestselling author of The Remix, and of course, multi-generational workplace expert. Thank you so much for coming on Tomorrowist.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Before we say goodbye, I encourage you to subscribe to Tomorrowist wherever you get your podcasts. You can find all our episodes at shrm.org/Tomorrowist, and while you're there, sign up for our weekly newsletter. Thanks for listening, and remember, the workplace is changing rapidly. You don't have time to be a futurist. Be a Tomorrowist.